This week on Worldview, the Dalai Lama marks his 90th birthday with a statement asserting sole control over his succession and reincarnation. As New Delhi moved in to support the Tibetan spiritual leader living in exile, and Beijing said it will enforce its approval over a successor, could India and China's newfound road to normalcy turn rough? And given the US's position, what are the geopolitical effects of the succession debate? We will have exclusive impressions from my trip to Lhasa last week. Hello and welcome. This is Worldview at the Hindu. I'm Suhasini Heather. Now, as I said, this week marks the 90th birthday of the 14th Dalai Lama, who's the head of Tibetan Buddhism, particularly of the Gelugpa sect. He's lived in India since 1959 when he fled from Lhasa after the annexation of Tibet by Chinese forces about a decade ago in 1950-51. Now, speaking in Dharamshala this week, the Dalai Lama made a statement asserting three things. One, that the line of the Dalai Lama, the institution for 700 years, will continue after him. Two, that the search for a successor would be conducted by what was called the Garden Phodrang Trust, made up of Tibetan lamas, authorities, in consultation with other Buddhist figures. And three, that the trust was the sole authority, indicating a message to China to say it will not have a role in deciding who will succeed him. Remember, in his latest book called Voice for the Voiceless, the Dalai Lama has also said that in order to fulfill the role required, the next Dalai Lama would be born in the free world, indicating perhaps the reincarnation would not be found in Tibet. Within hours, Beijing had responded to the statement, saying that the final choice of the next Dalai Lama must be approved by the Chinese central government, referring to an old Qing dynasty tradition of what is called the Golden Urn, and saying this must continue. Listen in.
The reincarnation of Dalai Lama must follow the procedure that consists of the research and identification of China, lost drawing from Golden Urn, central government approval, and comply with religious rituals and historical conventions, as well as Chinese laws and regulations.
However, New Delhi reinforced the Dalai Lama's message with Minority Affairs Minister Kiren Rijiju saying only the Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, can decide his successor. Finally, while the US has not so far weighed in on the latest reincarnation crisis, the US Congress has already passed the Tibet Support Policy Act in 2020, the Resolve Tibet Act in 2024 that supports the Dalai Lama and advocates against Chinese interference in the process. Now, the announcement that was made actually fulfills a promise that the Dalai Lama had made in 2011, where he had said that he will make it clear whether there will be a reincarnation after him at all. So he's made that clear. This had followed his division of his own office. He gave the political reins of administering and governing the Tibetan community in India and worldwide to the office of what is called the Sikyong, that runs the Central Tibetan Administration based in Dharamshala, while he retained spiritual leadership of the movement.
The core process of recognizing the reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is as per the unique Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Hence, we not only strongly condemn the People's Republic of China's usage of reincarnation subject for their political gain, and we shall never accept it.
In April this year, Penpa Shering, the Sikyong, had given The Hindu an interview, and you can read here more about how he sees the situation. This is, of course, an elected post made up of the Tibetan diaspora worldwide. In addition, there was this man, Samdong Rinpoche. He's a former Sikyong, former prime minister of the CTA, and a Buddhist teacher. And he seemed to indicate that the search will now only begin after the transition, as it's called. In other words, after the present Dalai Lama passes.
His Holiness is in good health, and he promised to live a much long life. So therefore, it is only an indication. Then the occasion comes, he will give the instructions, and it is not necessary at this moment.
Now, of course, remember the Dalai Lama himself has said he expects to live to at least 110. Given this scenario, what is likely to be the geopolitical impact that we see, obviously, in a world crowded with headlines? To begin with, for China, that really has managed to secure its control over Tibet in more than 60 years, the influence of the Dalai Lama and future Dalai Lama is the one thing that eludes Beijing. In 1995, remember, China actually recognized its own version of the Panchen Lama, one who was not recognized by the present Dalai Lama. And the Panchen Lama does not enjoy the same respect even within Tibet. But China is likely to double down on the reincarnation question now. Any country taking an opposing position will deal with Beijing's ire. Second, the US, that has locked horns with China over Tibet for decades, now hosts another Tibetan spiritual leader, the Karmapa Lama, and it is likely to raise his profile in any debate over succession for the greater Tibetan movement. Third, other Western countries that have significant parts of the Tibetan refugee diaspora, about 50 to 60,000, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and other European nations other than the US, will also take a position in favor of the exiled community. So what of the Tibetans actually living in Tibet? More than 7 million at last count. As part of our visit to Kailash Mansarovar, which I spoke of last week on Worldview, our group of journalists were also taken to Lhasa. Now, this was an escorted visit with Chinese officials and diplomats accompanying us, so we were limited by what we could see or whom we could speak with clearly. But the changes over the past few decades were quite evident. To begin with, there was the infrastructural development of airports, roads, highways, bridges, schools, buildings across Lhasa. The demographic change in Tibet is also evident, with official counts showing now 12 to 15% are Han Chinese. They're visibly more present in Lhasa, particularly in officials and others you meet. Remember, they were originally brought into Tibet under the guise of having to carry out construction work there. The second is the cultural changes. The language and the signage of the streets is official Chinese Mandarin, while Tibetan is used by the locals. Many Tibetan groups have been complaining about the fact that Tibetan language is being erased from schools, that it's not being taught, especially to Tibetans coming from rural areas. Although one school we were taken to, as I said, part of this official tour, did have Tibetan classes, Mandarin is clearly the preferred official language there. The third change is spiritual and religious. At the Potala Palace and the Jokhang Temple, all references to the present Dalai Lama are now erased. It is banned by law to worship him or to display his images, and the red Chinese national flag of Communist China is placed above all buildings, including temples and monasteries. This, in a sense, is the center of Lhasa, away from the Potala Palace, if you like. This is where the other icon, Jokhang Temple, is there behind me, and we're standing on what is called Barkhor Square. Now, I've been here before, as I've said, in 2007 and then in 2014. So while it's difficult to really gather from people exactly what the situation is, some comparisons certainly can be made from the past of what I've seen. This area behind me has certainly been cleared out. It used to be a market place, and it was filled with bustling stores. Those have been cleared, and more firm construction, cement shops have been built instead. Another thing you see is many more signs of shops in Chinese, in Mandarin, compared to the ones in Tibetan language. And as you can see, the kind of population that you see in Lhasa is now much more of the ethnic Han Chinese than perhaps I had seen before. Even so, for those whom I was able to speak to, the Dalai Lama continues to be loved and venerated amongst the people. And I was told by many Tibetans that they would be following the 90th birthday celebrations in Dharamshala closely, albeit behind closed doors. So what is India's position today? The first remains the old one. New Delhi recognizes the Tibetan Autonomous Region as a part of China. Second, that the Dalai Lama remains an honored guest and a spiritual leader in India. The third, Prime Ministers of India have wished the Dalai Lama on his birthday at times, exchanged greetings with him, but officials don't take part in the political events of the community here. Fourth, that the Tibetan community of refugees and their descendants are welcome to stay on in India, about 100,000 people estimated to be here. And the CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration, and the Parliament in Exile are both housed in Dharamshala. Although remember that New Delhi doesn't actually offer citizenship to Tibetans born here after 1987 in the automatic category. Meanwhile, since 1979, here's been another part of it. When India and China re-established their ties after the 1962 war, India-China bilateral relations have their own particular trajectory that is not deterred by the Tibet question. So you will see the visits by the officials from New Delhi to Beijing and vice versa, meetings at the top. We saw 20-odd meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, but that continues, perhaps not deterred and certainly not influenced by what is their position over Tibet. There's more of all of this. I know it sounds a bit complex, but I did tackle it in a previous Worldview on the issue you may like to watch from 2021. So what's Worldview's take? The Dalai Lama is respected worldwide, and India's decision to offer him refuge in 1959, despite the obvious repercussions from China, has earned it enduring respect. New Delhi must, however, fully analyze the possible scenarios after the 90-year-old Tibetan leader passes and plan its next steps, especially with regard to the Tibetan community that's based in India, both for the political and the geopolitical impact. Taking a neutral or ambiguous stand would only weaken India's position, given the clarity with which both Beijing and Washington are moving ahead on the subject of reincarnation and the future of the Tibetan movement after. And time for some Worldview reading recommendations. And of course, there's a lot more of my writing on www.thehindu.com, and I would urge you to read my travelogues as well as my analysis pieces, both from Lhasa and from Dharamshala. But other books for you. One, of course, is The Voice of the Voiceless. I spoke about it, by the Dalai Lama. And if you haven't already read his older book, Freedom in Exile, you should. Then there's a book called Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty. This is by Dilip Sinha, a former Indian ambassador. There's The Great Game in the Buddhist Himalayas, India and China's Quest for Strategic Dominance, by a scholar as well as a former diplomat, Funchok Stobdan. There's Nehru, Tibet and China by Avtar Singh Bhasin, a look at all the formal documents around this issue. Tibet, a personal history. Tibet is one book, and Tibet, a personal history of a lost land by Patrick French. And if you have a turn for the historical journeys, the oldest book, Young Husband, the last great imperial adventurer on the man who led the British invasion of Tibet in 1804. So this has been a slightly longer edition of Worldview, but we do hope you enjoyed watching it, and join us again from the team. Thank you.